Welcome everyone to part 7 of our Unit 6 module. So what we're going to be talking about today is adulthood. Last time I saw you, we were looking at adolescence, and now we'll be looking at basically the segment of life after that, which is adulthood. We pretty much, in psychology, look at all of adulthood together as opposed to breaking it into too many other pieces. So the first thing we want to do, obviously, is just talk about, what do we mean when we say adulthood? What are we referring to? So adulthood is going to encompass the changes that occur in biological and psychological domains of human life from the end of adolescence until the end of one's life. So that's like basically the really wordy way of saying we're just talking about what's happening after adolescence until the end of your life, until your death. Everything in between there is going to be adulthood. We will break it up a little bit into a little bit smaller chunks, but generally we can kind of refer to the entire section as adulthood, that entire part of our life. There's also another important piece, which is what is called the social clock. So the social clock is the timing of social events such as marriage, parenthood, and retirement. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this in just a second, but basically this idea that society has kind of general expectations about when these things should be happening, right? You might also have these expectations from family members, from your peers, but in general, society is going to kind of have a general time frame of when it thinks you should get married, when it thinks you should be a parent, when it thinks you should retire. All of those things are kind of on this social clock we could talk about. So our first kind of division of adulthood is what is called emerging adulthood. Emerging adulthood is the developmental phase that spans between adolescence and adulthood. So this is kind of like usually like I think of these as like your college students, like your college age students, where they aren't really adolescents anymore. They are definitely full-grown adults, but they aren't necessarily kind of really far into adulthood. They aren't necessarily all the way in. It's kind of a newer idea. Again, we're just kind of adding in this transitional period, as obviously over time we've kind of transitioned into adulthood slower and slower, right? Back in, if you were going to talk about like the 40s or the 50s or before that, generally speaking, once you weren't a child anymore, once you weren't in school, you were considered an adult. You were out on your own, you were working, you were studying, you were doing whatever it was, and that was kind of it. People also were getting married a lot younger, right? They're having kids younger. They weren't living as long. All those things kind of squish these things in. As those things have all stretched out, where we are getting married later, we're having kids later, we're living longer, we're more likely to spend time like living with our parents after we're in high school, right? All those kind of things have added kind of this new section where we call it emerging adulthood, where we're kind of in between. We're not adolescents, but we're maybe not necessarily all the way into adulthood yet. And really the people that are going to be in this are people who don't have children, who live with their parents, or who don't have enough income to be self-reliant, are falling into this developmental phase. So again, a lot of times you can think of people like college students, right? They may be fitting any or all of these different measures. You can think about people who are maybe living with a bunch of roommates, right? You would consider this emerging adulthood as well, where you're not totally independent yet. Remember, the boundary for what we consider adulthood, at least psychologically, is independence, right? Where you've hit independence. So you're living on your own or with your significant other. That would be considered that kind of independent mark. Okay. Now again, we can talk about this social clock, right? This kind of this boundary that we think of, or this social idea of when we should be doing different things. So in emerging adulthood, the social clock that we're going to kind of see is this question of the right time to leave home. When should I be moving out on my own? When should I be living on my own as opposed to with my family or with my parents? And you could maybe add in even with, roommates or something like that. Would all be kind of within this phase and this social clock idea. Continuing to look at our early adulthood here. This is our next step, yeah. Emerging adulthood, early adulthood. Don't get those too confused, right? Like I just did. Again, we've got emerging adulthood, and we've got our early adulthood. So our early adulthood is in our mid-20s, right? So I mentioned before kind of like our emerging adulthood is kind of like our college age, right? So up until kind of into your 20s a little bit. Once we're in our mid 20s, generally we're going to be considered in this early adulthood phase. So in this phase, we are reaching our peak in our natural physical abilities, which is coming with kind of the maturation of our bodies. This is one of the big things that's happening. So we're hitting our peak of muscular strength, of cardiac output, reaction time, sensory sensitivity. All those kind of things are kind of at their peak. If you look at, for example, like professional athletes, or just in general regular people, this is the time that they are kind of in like the best physical shape generally. Now, obviously, like, everyone's life is a little different. You may go peak up and down and whatever, but generally this is biologically where you're set up to be in the best physical kind of shape throughout your life. Our next section is looking at middle adulthood. So after early adulthood, we move into middle adulthood. So first we're going to talk about just the physical development that's going on during early adulthood. So early adulthood is from between 40 to 60. Okay, 40 to 60. So early is running kind of up until that boundary, and then we get into middle adulthood. At this point, this is kind of where aging becomes kind of apparent, and we actually can kind of see the effects of aging, right? Up until, like, from being an elementary school kid or an infant, up until you start getting into your 30s, you really are kind of like going, I don't know, I would say like going upwards, right? You tend to be getting bigger and stronger, and more athletic, right? Obviously, as long as you like take care of yourself, but you're kind of going in a pretty much upward trajectory. Once we start getting into our 40s and throughout our 60s is where we start to kind of see some of those aging things happen. So we start to experience some of the effects of aging. So our vision and our hearing are the first to begin to decline. So usually in the 30s, and it declines for almost everybody. So in about our 30s, we're going to start to see vision and hearing decline. Obviously, it depends. Some people it's going to decline really, really quickly. Some people it's going to be slow. If you already have bad vision or bad hearing, obviously it might be more apparent. But we'll start to see this decline in our vision and in our hearing moving into our middle adulthood. We're also going to see in men the gradual decline in sperm count, in testosterone level, and in the speed of erection and ejaculation, right? All those pieces are connected. Testosterone is obviously the male sex hormone, so that's going to be affecting these different pieces of these different physical pieces for men. On the other hand, we also have women who go through menopause. So menopause is the basically where the reproductive organs begin to function inconsistently. So we're going to see a decline in estrogen in women, just like we see a decline in testosterone in men. We're going to see, again, this inconsistency in the reproductive organs, and eventually we'll see the end of reproduction. So menopause is basically the process of going from being pretty much fully reproductive, I don't know if that's the best word for it, but for them functioning consistently until basically getting to the point where they are no longer functioning. You're no longer able to reproduce. Generally speaking, this end to our reproductive cycle, so the menstrual cycle, which is the periods, and fertility is going to end around the age of 50-ish, right? Again, everyone's a little bit different, but it's going to end around then. One of the big differences is, although we see a decline in reproductive ability in men and women over time, one of the big differences is that men never fully lose the ability to reproduce. They are able to reproduce and make their reproductive cells, which are sperm, for their entire lifetimes, where women are born with all of the eggs that they will ever have, so they're not creating them throughout their life. So at some point during this menstrual period, they eventually just run out, and there are no longer any eggs, and they're no longer able to reproduce. Okay, again, generally it's going to happen around 50. Now, this process involves a lot of hormonal changes, and it lasts anywhere from 6 months to 5 years. Again, that's obviously a really big range because people vary a lot. Some of the things that we might see due to these hormonal changes are anxiety, poor memory, inability to concentrate, depressive mood, irritability, mood swings, and less interest in sexual activity. And again, we can kind of connect these all to differences in hormones, which again, we see hormones affecting not these things specifically necessarily, but affecting our behaviors, affecting our moods, affecting our cognitive abilities throughout life, right? It's one of the same things we see in adolescents, where because of they're going through puberty, they're also being hit with a hormonal cocktail. So it changes how they feel, it changes their emotions, it changes their, it increases the likelihood of things like depressive mood and irritability and mood swings as well. We're seeing kind of those same, or at least similar, effects happening during menopause as well. Again, because it's this basically this cocktail of hormones that are changing inside of their body. So let's talk a little bit more about physical development here. So the potential lifespans of human beings is estimated to be about 222 years. That is the longest recorded lifespan. There are some other differences that some people have claimed to be longer, but I don't think that they have been what's the word? We can't know for sure, I guess. We're not positive about those years or not. This lady here that I'm kind of partially covering, and I can't remember her name, I believe she's from France, if I remember correctly, is actually the lady who lived to be 122 years old. Again, this is a little old, so it could also just been replaced by now by somebody else. But that's basically the potential lifespan, right? That's kind of where, at least where we are today, where we think the maximum extent of a human life is. That there's at some point, we can't go any further at some point. Now, for most people, obviously, we're not going to make it to 122 years old. And that's really where life expectancy becomes more useful for us. So life expectancy is going to refer to the average expected lifespan. So again, this will vary depending on a whole lot of things. It's generally based off of a few factors, right? So they'll look at different countries, like where do you live, what region do you live in. They can look at socioeconomic factors have an effect. They can look at genetic factors technically can have an effect. And then they'll also look at what year you are born, right? That also affects it. So they can kind of look at these in a different ways and basically estimate, the expected lifespan of different groups of people. Obviously, this doesn't work for individuals necessarily, but it's for those kind of groups. Now, the world average lifespan has increased from 49 in 1950 to 69 in 2010. So it's gone up about 20 years, which is a huge jump, obviously. And as we kind of go forward, that has continued to rise slightly, but not incredibly quickly. There was a very fast increase kind of in basically you could say the 1900s, right? Throughout the 1900s. And that increase has kind of slowed as we continue on. And again, this might be one of the things that points to this idea that eventually we'll just hit a maximum lifespan, that there will be a point where we can't ever live any longer. Now, again, we can also look at differences in different countries. So in 2012, South Africa, the life expectancy was 49. In Pakistan, it was 66. The United States was 75. Ireland was 80. Australia was 82. And Japan was 84. Now, again, this is something that can be very useful. Sometimes we could look at these different numbers, look at different countries and say, okay, why is it that some people in countries tend to live a lot longer, right? Why do we see Japan, having this very, very high life expectancy and South Africa being much lower? Or why do we see the U.S. At 75, but, Australia at 82, right? What are the differences that are causing this to happen? And we can kind of break those things down, and obviously those are really useful for us when we talk about, okay, well, how do we get people to live better lives? How do we make them more healthy? How do we make sure that they're going to survive for longer periods of time and be better off? So that's going to get us to talk a little bit about why we actually age, right? That's another question that's very important. So why do we age? What's actually going on here? So there's basically two factors that are going on. We can talk about the environment, and we can also talk about genetics. So our nurture or our environment. Basically, there's an accumulation of stress, damage, and disease wears us down until one of these factors kill us. It's a very kind of simple way of thinking it. If you think about your lifespan from when you're an infant throughout your entire life until eventually your death, you go through a bunch of different things, right? Your body goes through stress. Sometimes you get injured, you have damage, you break a leg, you get sick, right? All of these things kind of add up over time, right? And they add up and add up and add up. And eventually something is kind of too much and our body isn't able to deal with that anymore. And then we pass away, right? So that's one of the environmental reasons why we age. Now, we also can look at some things in genetics. So we know that there's actually some people's genes kind of actually protect them against certain kinds of damage. So, and again, this isn't like, I'm not going to give you super specifics here, but basically we can look at some people's genetics and for whatever reason, their genetics protect them better against certain things, right? Maybe they heal a little bit quicker. Maybe they are able to bounce back quicker from psychological damage. Maybe they deal with stress better. All of those things are things that can kind of help protect you, right? Stress is incredibly hard on the body. So if for whatever reason my genetics predispose me to deal with stress really well, that's going to help me basically age better, right? Because I'm not dealing with that stress on my body. I'm not dealing with that damage to my body. Now, that being said, even with great genetics or perfect genetics, and even with a really good environment, we will still see aging, right? This isn't like we can put somebody with perfect genetics and a perfect environment and they'll just never age. We still do see aging. So we look at what are called telomeres. So telomeres are the tips of chromosomes. So if you remember, when you think about, this is more of a biology thing, we haven't talked about it too much, but when you think about how cells reproduce and how they copy themselves, right? You've got DNA. We have those DNA, basically they unzip themselves and they make copies, right? And then they zip themselves back up. So then there's two copies of everything, right? We kind of do that over and over again. Well, as you live, all of the cells in your body are doing that all the time, every single one. Your neurons are doing it all the time. Your skin cells, your heart cells, your liver cells, your eyes, all these cells are basically replacing themselves. They're dying or they're being damaged, and then they're being reborn and recreated over and over and over again. So as this process happens, as we unzip and rezip this DNA and these chromosomes, the tips of them, again, the telomeres, actually wear down. So every time we duplicate these cell in our body, which we're doing again all constantly, we're wearing down the information, basically, right? We're wearing down that DNA, we're wearing down those chromosomes. And eventually, right, this is one of the things that's causing aging, right? It's one of the things that causes us to see the physical changes in our bodies, the changes in our brains, the changes in our abilities. It slows down our healing. This is why elderly people are generally much more susceptible to illnesses. All of this can kind of be affected by this idea that our cells basically just kind of wear themselves out after a while. And again, what this really points to is this idea that, although it might not be 122, there is basically a limit that will eventually hit, because regardless of how healthy we are or how good your genetics are, we're always going to see this wearing down of our cells. And so there isn't really kind of any way to escape that, at least, at this point in time. All right, so continuing to talk about aging. So one of the big things about aging is obviously we see a decline in a lot of different things, a lot of different abilities. So I'm just going to kind of list these off as different abilities that will decline as we age. Now, these are things that are going to apply to most everybody, right? That generally speaking, these are going to apply to the vast majority of people. So our first one is visual acuity, which we already talked about, which is both the sharpness and the brightness of how we see, how well we see. We also have hearing, which is especially sensing higher pitches. So we actually lose the ability to hear higher pitches throughout our lives. If you've ever seen like the apps or the ringtones that you can get on your phone that are I can't remember what they're called right now, but basically like your parents can't hear them. That's actually a real thing. Those things actually do work. Children's ears can hear at higher pitches than adults, and over time, basically, you lose that ability. So, if you have a pitch that's playing at a certain height, basically, people that are over a certain age, or generally people that are over a certain age, won't be able to hear it. So we kind of lose that ability over time. Our taste, our touch, and our smell also become less sensitive. Our reaction time and our general motor abilities, our ability to move around in general, are going to decline, as well as our muscular strength. Again, all these pieces are kind of just declining over time. We also see our neural processing speed, especially for complex and novel tasks, is going to slow down. So in general, the way our neurons are going to process, the way we're going to think, is going to slow down. But we see that especially affecting our ability to think about complex and especially new complex tasks. Again, this has to do with our crystallized versus our fluid intelligence, which we've already talked about in cognitive psych. And again, I always give the example of the idea that, if you try to teach like your grandparents or something like that how to use a computer, it's very, very challenging for them, right? Part of that has to do with just the physical changes that are happening in their brain, that it's making it more challenging, making their brain function in basically just a different way. And then also our body's ability to fight disease, our immune system also weakens over time, which again, I already just mentioned about this kind of susceptibility to illnesses because that disease fighting ability has kind of weakened as we go. So this is just kind of a recap of something I actually already talked about, exactly this, fluid intelligence versus crystallized intelligence, right? So fluid intelligence, again, is going to be our abilities that require speed, rapid learning, and are dealing with novel tasks, right? These are generally going to diminish as we age. Our crystallized intelligence, which is our learning knowledge and our skills, something like vocabulary or a recipe, are going to actually improve over age. And again, this meme is exactly showing that, right? You can have someone who is a grandparent who remembers, every single person in your family back 100 years, but, doesn't know how to find their email or can't drive because they don't remember which one's gas and brake, or how to get home, right? Those are all things that are connected with these different ideas of fluid intelligence versus crystallized intelligence. So now we're going to talk a little bit about aging and the brain specifically. So first we have dementia. So dementia is a broad kind of umbrella that encompasses a variety of different basically cognitive declines in general. Now, one thing that's really important to know about dementia is not a normal part of life. So I don't say that to say that, if you have dementia, you're weird or anything like that, but not everyone gets dementia. I think sometimes there's kind of this idea that as we get older, we all kind of like start losing memories and we all go through dementia. The reality is that's not true. Dementia is kind of a specific issue that certain people have. Now, again, it encompasses a lot of things. One of the most common, most widely known examples of dementia is Alzheimer's, right? Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. So some of the symptoms of dementia are decreased ability to recall recent events and the names of familiar objects and people, emotional unpredictability, or so like going from a flat to an uninhibited to an angry emotion. So flat emotion basically means like no emotion, where they're just not showing any emotion at all. Uninhibited is like kind of overly emotional. You can think of like, whenever I think of like the idea of what someone looks like if they're uninhibited, is like someone who's drunk, right? Where they're overly expressive, overly emotional. Whether those are positive or negative emotions doesn't really matter. It's just that they're overly, they're uninhibited by what we would normally do to control our emotions. And then angry, right? So they would be kind of unpredictable. Someone with dementia will shift through these emotions very quickly, or shift kind of randomly through different emotions. We'll also see confusion, disorientation, and eventually the inability to think or communicate. Usually we think of this disorientation or confusion when we think about Alzheimer's or when we think about dementia. That's probably what you think of the most, right? You think of them, forgetting people's names, or this top part, right? Forgetting people's names or forgetting where they are, being confused or being lost. Those are probably the general things that we think of. Now, again, dementia does tend to continue to decline, where eventually these people will lose the ability to think and to communicate, right? Their cognitive abilities will continue to decline until they aren't able to do really any functions at certain points. So our big example again is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of neurocognitive disorder. So there's a whole bunch of different things that we can look at and talk about with Alzheimer's disease. So what it is basically the loss of brain cells and neural network connections. So again, obviously our brain is made out of all these different neurons and other cells that are connecting to each other and communicating and sending, information and neurotransmitters back and forth. One of the big things about Alzheimer's is what we see is the cells actually dying. The neurons literally die. So, and this is kind of like there's this kind of cycle that goes on. So as those cells die, obviously that kind of kills the neural network, which is why we see the symptoms we see, why we see the inability to remember events or the inability to, do certain things. We see the differences in emotional. Eventually, we see it kind of deteriorate down to the inability to speak or move or function. So we're also going to see the deterioration of neurons that produce acetylcholine. So we talked about acetylcholine very briefly in the first unit or the second unit. We talked about biology. Acetylcholine is very important for memory, right? It's our memory neurotransmitter. So as those neurons deteriorate, and we have less and less acetylcholine, again, because that's involved in memory, that's going to harm our memory. We're also going to see shriveled and broken protein filaments forming plaques at the tips of neurons. So basically what's happening with Alzheimer's is we're seeing a whole bunch of different things going on. We have plaques, and we have what are called like tau tangles, which are basically kind of like little strings that generally hold stuff together. And what happens is due to some kind of problems that are going on, they kind of get stuck together. If you think about those plaques, they're sticky, they stick together. These tangles get all tied up with each other. And what happens is when those get wrapped up or stuck to these neurons, eventually it kills the neuron. Well, there's also other things going on. So we also see, for example, our glial cells will try to go around and clean these up. But one of the things that can also happen in Alzheimer's is that the glial cells, when they kind of glob around like an amoeba, they absorb stuff and they eat it, right? That's what they do. Now, normally, they would absorb stuff, they eat it, and it's not really a big deal. But one of the problems is they eat too much of things, it actually becomes poisonous and it kills the glial cells. And so what happens is we have this kind of cycle where a neuron will die or will have these plaques and tangles. The glial cells will try and clean them up, but they're not able to eat. They eat too much of it, and then they die, and then they need to be cleaned up, and it kind of starts this cycle where we're seeing all these different kind of pieces go, and that's where we'll see the decline that we see with Alzheimer's. One of the other things that's we see is the dramatic shrinking of the brain. So when you look at Alzheimer's patients' brains, they're actually much smaller. And they've basically shrunken down over the course of their life. Alzheimer's is very tough because it's one of the illnesses that you cannot identify it until after someone's life. So, for example, if someone's going through dementia, we can say they have dementia, we know that, but we can't determine if they have Alzheimer's until after they've passed away. Now, there isn't a treatment for Alzheimer's yet either, so or at least one that we know for sure is super effective. So it doesn't, it's not like we can't treat it. We don't have a way to do that anyway. But it's also very tough because it can also be hard to kind of study because we can't determine for sure until someone's passed away and we can do an autopsy and we can actually go in and look at their brain and see what's going on. So the last pieces we're going to talk about are coping with these ideas of aging and eventually death, right? So the first part is going to be just dealing with aging, coping with aging, and then also coping with, the eventual fact that we will die. So one of the things that we can talk about when we talk about coping with aging is midlife crisis. Or having a midlife crisis. So what that is an emotional or identity questioning crisis occurring in early middle age. So again, this is going to happen, usually around 25 to 30. Now, again, that age range doesn't have to be the exact one. We can also maybe see a midlife crisis in someone's 40s or maybe in their 50s, but it's generally going to happen in kind of like the middle age or at the beginning of middle age. Okay, that's usually where we're going to see it. Now, again, what's happening here is basically we start to question our life. And that's really what a midlife crisis is a questioning of our life. So we don't actually see a specific age when we look at people having midlife crises. It doesn't necessarily always happen at the same age. It's not like people turn 30 and they immediately have a midlife crisis or anything like that. But there are influences, again, on that social clock. So, for example, as you guys get older, you'll start to feel pressure from that social clock to do certain things. You'll feel pressure to get married, for example. You'll feel pressure to maybe have a career, depending on what you're doing after this. You'll feel pressure eventually to have children, especially if you're a female, right? Because you have the social pressure, but you also have kind of the biological pressure that at some point you lose that ability, right? So all of those things are these social clocks. So what can happen is if you get into your 30s, maybe you're 30 or 35 or something like that, and you look around at your life and you go, maybe, and a lot of times there could be a stressor, right? Something happens, you have a divorce or you have a fight or you realize that you're unhappy, you get depressed, right? Something like that could affect it. And you look around and you start to kind of question your identity. You start to question, is this what I should be doing? Is this what I really want to be? Is this what I want my life to be like? So that's really what a midlife crisis will kind of look like. For about 25% of adults who have this emotional crisis, the trigger seems to be the challenge of major illness, divorce, job loss, or parenting. So like I said, about a quarter of the people are having this triggered by specific events or a specific thing that they're having to deal with, right? This is pretty common in psychology in general. If we have these kind of emotional crises, a lot of times they're going to be connected with some sort of stressor that's going on, something that causes a problem. And again, obviously, all of those would be things that were very much a stressor. Our last piece is coping with dying. So we're going to watch a really cool video that we kind of look at a little bit of a lady, and I don't remember her actual name, what they call her job, but she's basically like a death counselor, I guess you could think about it. And her job is preparing people, not just the person dying, but also preparing the families of that person for the eventual death of that person, right? And what to do and how we go through it and how we make sure everything goes well. Overall, the way people respond to death varies quite a bit. So we do see some kind of differences that we can look at. So for example, grief tends to be more intense when the death occurs unexpectedly, especially if it's also too early on that social clock, right? So when people die, unexpectedly, so maybe like a car accident, for example, we're going to tend to see more grief than if someone, maybe has had cancer for 20 years and we've kind of known that they were going to pass away for a long time, right? Those are things that have to do with the intensity of that grief. Obviously, too, the idea of when that person passes away is also very important, right? So too early on that social clock. So when we have people who pass away, especially like children or young adults, or maybe people who are kind of just getting into a certain part of their life, right? Maybe they or maybe a little bit older, but they've just gotten married or something like that, and then they unexpectedly pass away. We're going to see a larger intensity generally of that death because of these different factors, right? Where again, when a grandparent, for example, it's still sad, obviously, but when it's someone who's gone through their life, they've had kids, they've lived, they've done kind of all the things that we consider the things that you need to do in your life as a society, the grief doesn't tend to be as intense. Now, that being said, there is no pattern or length that goes with grieving. So everyone grieves their own way. Everyone grieves for different times. Everyone grieves at different intensities. There isn't a pattern that we can really follow that goes with it. But one thing we do see is that there are ways to help with that grief. So, for example, having the support of friends or groups is very important, as well as facing the reality of death and grief while affirming the value of life. And that's a really important part. So one of the big things, and like I said, we'll see it in the video when we see the lady, about grief is, accepting that the reality is that we all die eventually, but also, and that we will be sad, right? That's an important part too, to understand that like we will grieve and we will be upset and we will hurt for at least a portion of time. But then at that same time, also affirming that life is valuable, right? Affirming that it matters, affirming that all these things are important, right? Those are big pieces. And we see these kind of things. I think a good example, which obviously depends on social groups and things like that, but something that we tend to see is like a celebration of life. A lot of times we've kind of seen those more often, I think, lately than we used to, where as opposed to just having obviously we still have funerals, but as opposed to having just a funeral, you have a celebration of life. And the idea is instead of focusing on, the fact that that person is gone, focusing on the positive aspects and the celebration of that person's life, right? So as opposed to trying to kind of like focusing on the grief aspect, focusing on, the good things that, that person brought throughout their life or other people's lives and kind of all those aspects. So we can kind of see some things that will help with grief, but again, there's not like a perfect way to get rid of it or anything like that. The last thing we'll do is we'll watch kind of this TED Talk that talks about, what is it that makes a good life? When we talk to people, when we interview people, when we do studies and we look at people's lives, what is it at the end that is the most important or the most meaningful, the most impactful, right? What should we be doing to live a good life? Okay. So that wraps up our video on adulthood. Again, we kind of a wide range of different things that we looked at. Take a few moments and please do a short summary, and then I'll see you next time.